Welcome to the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. Our theme for 2026 continues. The future of work, meaning is the new money. Because meaning is simply the greatest motivational force on earth. But 68% of the global workforce is disengaged, leaving $9.6 trillion in productivity on the table every year. Gen Z, the canary in the coal mine, is exposing structural failures everyone else learned to ignore, rationalize, or endure. I'm Dr. John Dentico, your host, bringing over 30 years of experience in leadership, strategic thinking, and designing solutions that solve real problems. This podcast delivers boots-on-the-ground intelligence, real conversations with CEOs, fractional executives, coaches, and small and medium-sized business leaders navigating the same crisis, mitigating the talent hemorrhage before competitive viability disappears. We go beyond symptoms like engagement scores and wellness programs to focus on the structural failures beneath them. Frontline intelligence, actionable frameworks, hard truths. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Now let's throttle up and dive into today's episode. Hello again and welcome to the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. This is your host, Dr. John Dentico. With me this morning is Colin Davis. You know, most very small businesses, the 2 to 10 person shops that quietly power local economies, hit a wall no one talks about. They're too established to wing it, too lean to afford the white glove coaching reserved for mid-market firms, and too personal to be solved by a generic online course. So the owner grinds harder, works longer, and wonders why growth keeps costing them their evenings. Colin Davis believes that's a solvable problem, but not with a new tactic or a better funnel. Colin argues that real growth starts with something far older: knowing yourself, clarifying your purpose, and mastering the principles underneath the practices. Colin is the founder of First Principles Coaching in Richmond, Virginia. Before launching the firm in 2021, he spent 2 decades in pastoral and nonprofit leadership, including years as a missionary and monk, sharpening the disciplines of listening, strategic thinking, and whole person development. Today, he blends ancient wisdom with modern systems thinking to help small business owners grow revenue, reclaim their time, and lead with clarity. And I am truly pleased and delighted to have Colin here with me this morning. Good morning, Colin. How are you today?
John's great. I can say that was a fantastic intro. You really kind of captured the whole thing. That's awesome.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll send you a copy of it and you can paste it on your refrigerator. And, for reviewing by the entire family. So we'll get that to you for sure.
I'm sure they'd
Colin,
be
let me
very
start
entertained.
Yeah. Let me start off by asking you my sort of first question, and that is, tell me a little bit more about yourself. Where did you grow up, and what were some of the fundamental influences in your early life?
I grew up the first 13 years of my life in Southern California. I always say that I've had a very winding path from the jump. My family was a blended family, so I have siblings from my parents' previous marriage. My dad, when I was 13, who was a small business owner, went bankrupt. The business failed. So he went looking for a job. We ended up moving to upstate New York, to this real kind of rusted out post-industrial town on the Hudson River. That was really hard. And then we went from there to Maryland, then to Virginia. My dad, meantime was he was building up capital really to rebuild the business. It's a success story at the end. He did rebuild the business. He's been very successful and figured out how to run a business. In the meantime, I was in high school, and right out of high school, because of some pretty powerful religious experiences that I had, I went off to be a missionary. And I did that, missionary and monk, and it's its own world unto itself. So it's kind of hard. There's a lot of nuances there. Like, what does it mean to be a missionary? What does it mean to be a monk? But that's the simple version, to keep it simple. I ended up working with leadership development and organizational development, helping organizations to grow, ministries, nonprofit, church groups. And then, kind of long story short, there's kind of a real winding path along that route, and then basically fell in love, wanted to get married, and didn't want to be paid $30,000 a year working for a nonprofit, which, there's nothing wrong with that. I wanted to raise a family, so I was really looking at what skill sets, the idea being overlap between what are my proficiencies, my skill sets, what am I passionate about, and where's profit, where can I make money and to raise a family. Through the encouragement of a coach that I have, I decided to start coaching. I don't know. How's that for kind of the arc?
Yeah, that sounds great to me. I mean, we all learn along the way and nothing goes to waste. That's one of the great lessons I've learned in my life is whatever you learn never goes to waste. It's just, it gets added into the final equation of the things that you've experienced, especially as I like to talk about with many of my guests, and that is the things you've learned from the school of hard knocks. Those things are irreplaceable. That's the one that builds the foundation of perseverance and grit.
Yeah.
I talk a lot about the fact that I've had 3 people on my podcast who all went to prison, and they would tell you that prison saved their lives.
Yeah.
And now today they're CEOs of different organizational companies. They got the message. Never once did I ever hear anybody talk about victims or victimization. They just had that aha experience one day and took responsibility and changed their lives. And I think that's just absolutely spectacular. That to me is really where the foundation is built. Let me, if I can, just go back to something you already said and follow up on that. And you were talking about your dad and his business, his failed business the first time, but then became very successful. In a sense, you saw him rebuild something stronger from the ashes. I mean, the quintessential phoenix, if you will.
Yeah.
Most kids walk away with a warning. You walked away with a calling. What did you see in that rebuild that still shapes how you coach entrepreneurs today?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of lessons packed into that. I think most fundamentally, this coincides with a lot of the background that I have and things that I've seen. My dad would not have been able to rebuild if he didn't have some humility, some character about him, and a strong drive, right? And then the perseverance, because it took him, I should do the math, but it was something along the lines of 15 years before, really getting the new one rolling, right? Maybe it was 10 years, but it's still, I mean, to spend a decade working on a goal is no small thing, right? So that's the first thing is like kind of the character. But then from a business perspective, really the most fundamental lesson is what Michael Gerber has been teaching for decades. The E-Myth. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
Some places well known, but it was one of the books that my dad picked up and it really changed his life. And Michael Gerber talked about in terms of working on the business versus working in the business. And we talk about like an operator or a technician versus an owner. That's another way of thinking about it. Like the skill sets of an owner of running a business are really different from the skill sets of doing the technical thing that delivers value, produces the product, and makes the service happen. The technical skills are different from the skill sets involved in running a business, right? So that kind of dichotomy was the biggest lesson that, the really solid principle for business.
No, yeah, well, it's great. I mean, sometimes it takes a lot longer than you think, in the sense that you think, oh, now's the time, and it's not the time. And a few years later, you go, now's the time, and it's still not the time. But you have to, I think one of the greatest attributes people have is perseverance, just hanging in there and sweating it out and just keep driving. You see stories all the time of people who did that in all walks of life. Musicians, you see a lot of that, it gets a lot of internet, a lot of attention, musicians who failed so many times and then eventually hit it. And it was a rocket ship after that. So I can greatly appreciate that. Let me ask you this. You named your firm First Principles Coaching. When a small business owner comes to you stuck, what does first principles thinking actually look like in the first conversation? What surface issues are you usually cutting through to get to the real problems?
Yeah. No, that's great. So The way that I would sort of diagnose, like, first conversation, right? I'm looking for four major areas that, and the way the business owner thinks about and organizes himself and his business, or herself and her business, around those sort of four big topics. And the first one is mindset. So that's like the psychological, the character, kind of characteristics, personality profile. I use the DISC, right? So like mindset is the first area. Like, how do they think about failure? How do they think about, like the problems in the business, those kinds of things, right? So that's the first area. Second area is time management. And there's a million really helpful techniques and tactics, but fundamentally in time management is, can you stay focused on something long enough to see it come to fruition? And how much are you scattered all over the place, right? Now, I'm a big believer, and this is partly because this is the way I tick. Like, I'm spinning plates all the time, all over the place. So there's some who would really preach that you got to stay focused on one thing, I don't think that's true. But if you're going to spin a lot of plates, you've also got to be honest with yourself. You're not going to make as much progress, and it's going to be a slower grind, and you got to have the perseverance to throttle up and throttle back, right? So time management's the other big place. The third big area is, how much are you building systems and flywheels, where put a lot of effort into things, and then that effort translates into a system that more or less self-perpetuates. And that's really, like how a business is built and scaled. And so how much are you actually doing that within the business? And then the fourth area would be team dynamics. How much of a culture is there? How much do people get along? How transparent is the communication? How much is there friction because of, personalities and that kind of thing? Those are kind of the four big areas to start with. And then I have sort of like beneath that a couple of frameworks that I really think of the most fundamental, like the first principles of business that we're trying to get at. How much are you thinking through these first principles? So I can keep going but I want to pause there for a second because that's already a lot.
Yeah. Oh, I get it. I think one of the things that I have always focused on personally is the why of something.
Right.
What is okay. To my detriment, probably at times. And I think I always tell the story. I relate it to sophomore mathematics in the high school that I went to in the Bronx. And I remember one day the mathematics teacher came in and all of a sudden just turned around and said, "Good morning," turned around and started writing formulas on the board. And for the rest of that class, I was completely lost. I mean, it was just, here's all the formulas. So, but no one ever, not any time that I remember, did he step back and say, "Let me tell you why we're learning this stuff. What's the why behind this?"
Right.
Many, many years ago. I remember when I was working on my MBA, there was a professor who started the course with, "Let me tell you why we're taking this course, why we're doing it." I got an A+ in that course because I had the big picture. Okay, this is the big picture. This is where we're going. I got it now. So it's always been very, very important to me. I think that's why, for me, I've always been very involved in things like strategic thinking and strategy. That's the why for me. But for example, I'm about ready to publish a field book, but I'm not doing much more other than trying to get that thing to the printer, if you will. Because for me, that's the why. Why are you doing anything else? What is your why here? And I've been there a long time before Simon Sinek. I'll tell you that right now, a long time.
Yeah.
He publishes why. He's got a great audience and he does well with it. But I mean, as it was part of my doctoral research and different things like that.
Well, you were to start with why before it was cool. So yeah.
I was there with why before it was way cool. And because it's always been, even back then when I was 16, 17 years of age, it was so important to me to get the big picture so that everybody understands how all the pieces are put together. And that's why strategic thinking today is such a big part of what I do.
Yeah.
So let me talk to you about that. Because I know that in your background, you're very big on strategic thinking. You understand why it is so important. So tell me in your own words about the importance of the why in terms of mission statement, the clarity of a mission statement, and how that connects to strategic thinking. You take it where you need to go.
I imagine we'll probably end up talking about this for most of the rest of the time because this is a great topic and it's a big topic and there's a lot of great things to unpack there. So the first thing that came to mind was, oh man, I was on a radio interview and they asked me, okay, well, if you just had to say that there was like, what is the first principle, right? Really nail you down, like really, and I said, purpose. Why? It's the first principle because nothing else makes sense without it. So that's the first thing that came to mind when you said that. Yes, I mean, absolutely. And when I was given my little framework or, like the 4 areas, right, a moment ago, mindset, the first question of mindset is really, and this is Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, right? Like, what is your why? Because that if you have a strong enough why, you can endure anyhow, right? That's the basis. That's the foundation for a strong, resilient mindset. Like, what drove my dad to spend a decade rebuilding? Yeah, strong why, strong purpose, a feeling that was part of his calling. That a lot we could unpack there. And then also in terms of the business, like when I say business systems, the very first thing that needs to be defined in a business is like you just said it. You talked about mission statement. Well, I would actually kind of broaden that a little bit. Talk about business identity. Just like a person has an identity that has to do with their purpose. Business identity, for me, consists in 4 elements, right? And the first one is your business model. How do you make money? There's 6 questions that you can answer that will give you a picture of what your business model is, right? Basically, how do you make a profit providing your service? That's the business model. Then the next one would be your values. What's the fundamental character? What kind of personality does the business have internally? Then it'd be vision and mission. And to me, I think those are really inseparable. Vision is about the impact you make on others. Mission is about the vehicle that makes that impact. So that's how I'd kind of define those 2 things, vision, mission. And the fourth area is marketing identity, which is about like what kind of reputation do you want to have externally? So a little bit different from the values, the internal values. And I think it's important to distinguish those 2 things. But those 4 things together are the business identity, right? And that's the first thing to contend with. That's the first thing we got to dig into, right? And in my background, I have 2 degrees in philosophy. And my 3 favorite philosophers are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle's like you could summarize his whole philosophy as teleology, which is telos in Greek means purpose, the end, direction something is going, right? So, and that's how we make sense of the world really is where are things going? What's their nature and how does it develop through time, right? That's literally how we make sense. So like Aristotle, who's just a tremendously powerful thinker, we're reading his stuff 3,000 years later, right? Or it's worth reading anyway. The first thing he always does is, here's what people usually say this topic is. So he's talked about physics, for example. Like, here's what people usually say this is. But let's get more precise. These are the major components of it. And so this is the strategic thinking piece, right? Here's the interacting parts of it. Here's the parts. And here's why it's important, right? For me, that deeply shaped how I think about everything. And I think I already had those dispositions as a kid. I think even just as a teenager listening to, grunge rock and feeling deeply about things and just, wondering about the meaning of life. I mean, that's where it all began. That was already baked into the way I think about and feel about things, right? But you asked me about the mission statement. I broadened it a lot. Actually, what I'm doing right now is just kind of laying out the pieces right now. Here's how I would think about purpose and the why. So again, I'll stop there. I've said a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you, I read Man's Search for Meaning in 1997, and it changed my life.
Yeah.
Because, as Frankl says, meaning is the why.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate why, meaning. Why am I doing this? Well, because it gives me meaning in my life. And I'll just mention this because I see such a great connection between Frankl's work and the work of the great scholar of mythology, Joseph Campbell. In 1987, I think I got this right, Joseph Campbell was interviewed by Bill Moyers for what has become a very famous The Power of Myth series. And I have the book. And in the book, Moyers asks Joseph Campbell, so tell me, Joe, is it that we're searching for the meaning of life? Is that what we're all about? And Campbell says, no, it's futile to search for the meaning of life. We're searching for the experience of being alive. And I think that connects directly to Frankl's sense of, I say it this way, it's not what life means to me, but what do I mean to life? How do I engage life? And when you take and I mean, these were things that just completely blew me away, completely opened my eyes. In fact, my theme for the last 2 years is meaning is the new money. And I got that from a guy named Nikhil Raval, who lived in America for a number of years and then had to go back to his home in India to deal with a very tragic accident that claimed the life of his mother, who's written books on Gen Z. And his observation is that everybody likes to, sideswipe those guys or do a drive-by on them in the sense that, the Gen Z, those kids today don't know.
Disaster, right.
They're a disaster.
They all want to be famous and they're distracted and all that.
All they want to do is have a money-making YouTube channel. And the answer is no. It's the fact that if they find no purpose, to use your term, if they find no meaning, if they find no connection, they don't stay. They need that. And so they'll rather have that, rather walk away from a job where they can't find a sense of connection and meaning and purpose than stay there and sacrifice, in a sense, their soul. I mean, that's kind of where they're at. And yet, here's the interesting aspect of that, and that's what my field report's going to show, is that what they are saying out loud is what the multi-generational workforce has said to themselves quietly. So the toxicity, if I can use that term, in organizations that we boomers like myself and millennials and Gen Xers dealt with, we put up with it. They're not putting up with it. And it's going to get very interesting by 2030 when they'll be 30% of the workforce. So from that perspective, I connect exactly with your notion of purpose, how important it is. And for me, when I talk about mission statements, it's got to be one sentence. It's got to be so clean and so clear that everybody in the organization can recite it from memory. So everybody understands, well, this is what we do. This is who we are. Is there any question? No, there's no question. So I'm absolutely on board with you there. I'm absolutely on board, and we see the world through the same set of lenses. But anyway, so I appreciate your comment. I'd love to throw it back to you and ask you if you have any reflections on what I just said.
We could spend a lot of time on this. And the question of mission statement, right? Would love to both get your reflections on it and also give a few of my own. Like I'm thinking about like right now, I'm engaged with a company to help to create an intentional culture because there's not really been a culture at this point. I mean, there's always a culture, but when it's very accidental, it's very loose and that leads to all kinds of problems. So, the very first thing to create an intentional culture is to define who are we? What are we about? And not just that, not just to define it, which, I can be kind of cynical about consultants and consulting, right? And I consider myself a coach in the sense of like, just like a coach is with a sports team all the way through to see like in it to win it. I don't want to just help the leadership team to create a mission statement to then be like, great, all right. I want to make sure that we really wrestle with the questions of who we are, what we're about, and then also communicate that and drive it, make it like an active force that actually changes things and makes a difference within the organization for each of the people. And I do think that's one of the reasons that it is important to capture it as a single sentence. Although, and here I'm curious what you think of this. This is where I push back a little bit. I don't think that's good enough. The single sentence. I think it's actually in some ways like can be detrimental to a culture. I think there needs to be 3 versions of a mission statement. The first one is the single sentence that's really boiled it all down. But usually when you capture it in a single sentence, it's very abstract. And I'm an abstract thinker. I love philosophy, but in some ways, because of that, because I've also done a lot of public speaking, and how do you communicate ideas to people, right? Abstract thoughts and sentences only make sense in their depth to people who were involved in crafting that. And then there's tons of different interpretations as it resonates with it, or as other people consider it, right? So to kind of overcome that hurdle, yes, you need it because it's extremely helpful. You want people to be able to recite it. But then I would suggest two other versions. Another version would be kind of like bulleted or a couple paragraphs of descriptions of what that means, right? That's the second version, a couple bullet list or a couple paragraphs. And then the third version would be stories. This is what it looks like in practice. This is what, even better, this is what we don't mean by it, and this is what we do mean by it. And that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to put those three versions together. It's not the kind of thing you can do in like a 30-day engagement as, a couple hours or just do an offsite kind of thing. It takes some time and some work, but I really think that you need to unpack it and put color and stories around it and then communicate incessantly. I love Patrick Lencioni. He talks about the 4 obsessions of an extraordinary executive. And just repeating those things again and again and again has to be an obsession of a great CEO. Okay, so I push back a little bit. I don't think the one statement is good enough. What do you think of that?
I agree. The one statement alone becomes the North Star, in my opinion. That's the North Star. In the process that I do, when I do a strategic thinking session, you have to start with the one sentence mission statement. That's the start. It's the foundational piece. It's the launching pad. My, what I call TSWG strategic thinking method then says, okay, if that's the mission statement, we're good with that. Now let's go through the strategic thinking process where we find things like, what are the hindrances that stand in the way of us achieving our mission? So that we lay all that out. Again, these are the bullet points.
Which would be akin to, yeah, right. Yeah.
And then, okay, what do we do well? And then the next one is, what don't we do real well? It looks a lot like SWOT. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It looks a lot like SWOT, except it's not SWOT, and I'll explain why. And then from those 3 elements, you get gaps. Okay, what are the gaps between what we do well, what we don't do well? How do we achieve our mission by closing the gaps? Those gaps now become the pieces we actually feed into the strategic planning process.
Yeah, the priorities.
Now, where are we going to spend money? What's the priorities? Here's our mission. In order to achieve that mission, where can we get the bang for the buck? And I always tell people all the time, don't pick the hardest one. Pick the one that's sort of medium hard. Let's get a win here. Let's get over the hurdle. Not only that, but for a new culture, for a new organization, you're learning your way through the process. This is all learning as well. Okay, well, that worked out really well. Let's take something else on. So to me, that is really important. The other thing, too, and this may be controversial, and I'm going to push back a little.
Yeah.
I don't use the term vision anymore.
Oh,
I push that aside.
Sure.
And I was heavily influenced by C.K. Prahalad and Gary Hamel's book, Competing for the Future, in which they talk about the difference between vision and foresight. I'm much more on the side of foresight because foresight can be constructed. You can construct foresight. You look at the trends, today's trends in technology, in demographics, in politics, for example. You look at all the different leading indicators and extrapolate that into the future. You can see the future based on what is actually happening today. Now, I will say this. It becomes a little murky here when we're talking about AI, okay?
Yeah,
because
things,
there are so many people, the hype engine is at a tremendous level that people keep telling us what the future is going to be, more as a vision rather than constructing a foresight-based prognosis of what's coming in the future. So for me, and those things, the foresight become the elements that support or define the purpose. So that's kind of more, I see that as, I love to construct foresight. For example, in my lead simulations, in the leadership simulations that I created over 30 years ago, one of the things you come away with is foresight. I will take you into a realistic scenario where a number of people are playing. We used old computers. We had 7 tables, and I constructed, there were 7 different groups playing 7 different stakeholders in a realistic scenario. This is the reality.
Like role play, like.
Yeah, very much role playing as the stakeholder you're assigned to. I wanted people to walk in different shoes.
Yeah.
And it worked extremely well.
Which is brilliant for training. I mean, there's a lot of really cool elements to that kind of construct. Yeah.
Yeah. I spent a good portion of my book, Throttle Up, talking about actually what goes on in the brain when you do that, the brain mechanics of it. But in any case, so when people walk out of the simulation, they had foresight. They could see, if we continue to do this, man, we're going to be in trouble. We've got to change this whole dynamic, and it was not something I said, change the dynamic. I let the simulation speak. I let the data speak, as they say.
Right.
So anyway, but that's enough about me.
Actually,
go ahead.
I would love to pick up a little bit there.
Go ahead.
So the interesting thing, because obviously these are things I'm deeply interested in. And so how about the reality distortion field of Steve Jobs? Very famous. That, like when he was set on something, like people got in his orbit and they just became convinced that they could do it, even though it just seemed ludicrous to anyone who, wasn't actually talking with him, right? So do you think it could happen that if someone is using foresight, and this, I think there's a lot of, like teasing out what you actually mean with the semantics, right? But if someone's using foresight, they would say that we could never produce a Steve Jobs because he had such vision and force of will and force of character that he saw the thing and he was going to make it happen, right? And that is a visionary quality versus someone who says, foresight, here's the trends, we'll go with the trends. We end up just being Blockbuster and not Netflix. I mean, I'm raising this as an objection, although I'm sure you have a good reply to it, so I'm not trying to debunk at all. Just no. I'd like to get your understanding of what, because I think traditionally that would be, or at least in my mind, like visionary would be, I see the thing, I'm drive towards it and I make it happen. And then foresight would be like the Blockbuster. Well, all of our data says that we just need more of the new releases, right? As Netflix is totally going to blow up.
It's a great question. I think you can still drive towards the vision. You can still have that, say, hey, listen, this is where we want to go. But here are the things that are either going to help us or hurt us to get there. Okay. Now, you have to understand that when I talk about leadership, I'm not talking about a person, which is still 95% of what people talk about when they say the word leadership, even though there are over 400 different definitions of leadership. I see leadership as a process. To me, it's the process of leadership. And I talk about this all the time, and that is over 30 years ago when I started working on my own model of leadership, it was founded on one principle, and the one principle was contribution. We have a problem, we have an issue. Who has an idea? Who can jump in here and help us? So for me, leadership is what people do together as a process. So inviting people to be part of trying to figure out how, and I think Jobs did this. I think it wasn't just Jobs driving. It was Jobs surrounding himself with people who could see things that perhaps he didn't see, or ask hard questions that drove the strategy to take Apple where they wanted to go. And so I understand vision as, this is the lofty view of where we want to go. But you can't just say, let's go there. You need the process to help you get there. And for me, the process of leadership, where you invite people to be part of the solution, is very powerful in how it can take the things we uncover in foresight and use that information and that knowledge to help build a pathway to the future. How does that sit with you?
No, what I was thinking of, man, how do I articulate this? Amen. It's a great way of thinking about it. And to me, what you just said and kind of this discussion also indicates one of the reasons that I fell in love with like Aristotle, his thinking, and just the way that I would something I talk about all the time is that basically the one thing that guarantees failure is what I call reductionism. And it's a little ironic reducing everything to one thing and then saying that that's the one problem. The one problem is that thing's one problem, right? What I mean by that, again, like kind of the Aristotle way of thinking about things. Well, what are the moving parts within it, right? So Steve Jobs' example, it's not like he was a visionary and able to do things just because he had this like will to power that he was just going to make things happen, that he was, this arrogant jerk, which sometimes he was, but that had to be combined. And again, like an ancient idea, virtue, like true strength, is the foundation of virtue is temperance, which actually means mixing of elements. So it's not just that he had this like vision, right? But using this terminology, he also had foresight. He did understand the technology well enough to say, okay, we're going to combine this, we're going to combine this. He didn't have all the details there, but like he understood it well enough and where the markets were going and what people. So he had this combination of abilities. It was in the combination that made for powerful leadership, right? Which included, the humility to surround himself with brilliant people, the humility to form a team and know he couldn't do it himself, the humility to take objective reality as a given and work with objective reality, as well as his own subjective like vision and desire. So to combine those elements, not just say, well, like this is reality, I can't do it, or just to say like this is what I want, it's going to happen, right? It's actually okay. This is what I want, it's going to happen, and I also need to work within the parameters, the constraints, but maximize them. And I also need the people skills, and I also need the ability to drive it through the organization and the discipline, and we need systems to do that and processes to do that. So I think often in conversations, for the sake of communication, we simplify things, which is not a bad thing for the sake of communication. But when you really actually try to understand it, there's these various pieces at work that you kind of point to as, well, look at how important that is, right? So that's where my mind goes. What do you think of all that?
I think one of the things I'm going to bring in on my report, and it's something you said earlier, and I think it doesn't get enough attention across the board, and that is this idea of values alignment. Okay, values alignment. People, not every person who joins every organization will fit with the values of that organization.
Absolutely.
I was thinking back when you were talking about Steve Jobs, there's this great picture of Jobs in what they call, I think they referred to it as, I think this is right, and I hope people will forgive me if I get this wrong. What Jobs created when they were working on the Macintosh, just before its release in 1984, was a Apple skunkworks, in the sense that they had this group of folks that were kind of cordoned off from everybody else.
Yep.
That was working on the concept of a graphical user interface, the first one introduced in the Macintosh, that famous commercial at the Super Bowl in 1984. And there's this picture of these really gnarly looking folks surrounding Jobs with the Macintosh sitting on a desk, and all these people, there's no doubt in your mind that Jobs surrounded himself with people who were values aligned with him on getting this thing done, on making it actually happen. And I think that, and it's a very, very important issue, certainly for Gen Zers. They're looking for values alignment. Does my value, values align with this organization. Not saying everything, not saying all the time it's going to work out that way. This is a very interesting philosophical discussion here, which is great, by the way. And that's one of the key indicators is we have a vision. Okay, I'll use that term. We have foresight associated with the particulars of what's really going on right now. We are guided by a mission statement. Okay, and the question becomes: the people that are working with us, are they working to the same core values as the organization? And I think that's so very important. I'll give you the other two that are very important, and that is the the second one is personal agency. Do I have the ability to act? Can I act here? Or am I constantly running around seeking permission, looking for someone to empower me to do something that I know needs to be done? I mean, we hire people, very smart, intelligent people. We bring them in, and now we have to give them permission to do the things that we hired them to do.
And they're waiting for me to tell me what to do? Like, what? Like, I want you
Right.
to use your horsepower. Yeah.
That's right. I got it. And the third one is there growth trajectory here? In other words, I start here in this company and I'm at level A. I want to get to level C. Is there a pathway? Or as I said to one of my other guests, or are we shopping for knowledge and development courses as though we're shopping in a farmer's market? You know, we're wandering around. I'll take some peas over here. I'll get some
This
carrots
looks good.
over there.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
That
maybe
looks
I could do
good.
something
Yeah, I'll
with
take that.
All
That
right.
looks good. Yeah, let me get that AI course over here. Will that help me? I don't know. You know, that kind of a thing. So those are the three big things that Gen Z looks for. And I know that most folks, whatever generation they're a part of, are looking for that as well. So I think there are systems and processes that we can use that help fill out the picture of what the mission is and how everybody can be part of that. I think too often, and I've had so many people laugh at this, you walk into a lobby of an organization and there's a mission statement in stainless steel on the wall. And the answer goes, yeah, okay, but do you live that every day? Do you do it every day? Is it your mantra? Because too often, I think organizations look at a mission statement as part of branding, and that's okay. You know, this is who we are, love us.
Yeah.
But they don't think about it as this is the energy that feeds the people inside the organization. And when you don't have personal agency, you don't have trust. And trust is huge. Because
Without it, nothing really operates. I mean,
Nothing
you have to
moves.
create all these workarounds. There's all kind of like
Nothing
shadow
moves.
sub-organizations within the organization. Yeah, amen.
Yeah. So to me, I think that there are different roads that lead to Rome, in a manner of speaking. I have found for me there are that have to be observed. One is the mission statement, the clarity of it, the cleanness of it, the brevity of it. You know, that is really becomes the focal point, and the rest you can fill in with different strategic thinking, strategic planning processes, and fill out the picture so everybody goes, okay, I understand where we're going now. I know what we're doing. I'll tell you a story. A couple of years ago, I did a presentation, and I was invited by a company, small company, to come and help them do a strategic thinking session because they couldn't find the pieces. They said, we're paying quarterly bonuses, and the needle is not moving. We don't understand. So they said, you got to come out down here and help us find the missing pieces. So the first thing I asked them for was a mission statement. It was a page long. I said, I can't use this. So this is omnidirectional. I can't use this. So I reduced it to a couple sentences, and sent it to the general manager. We agreed this was a starting point. Okay, it's not the end. So we did it. We found the missing pieces. We found what the problems were, the issues, and everybody, you know, including the CEO of the company, stood up and said, yeah, that looks like it. We need to work on that. And just before I left, or as we're getting to winding down the day, they said, listen, John, can we work on the mission statement? Sure, sure is. So they took a sentence that must have had 15 or 16 words in it, and they cut it to 7 words. They said, that's who we are. And I knew we hit gold when they stood up and said, that's who we are. That's exactly who we are, and that's what we do. CEO is sitting right there. Look at right now. Go, okay. But now they had a real sense for everything around us now makes sense if we stay down, we stay on this road. So I agree with you. I think there has to be more. But how we orchestrate that and how we involve people in that is a lot of what I like to do. And because you can't do it alone. I mean, you just can't do it alone.
No.
And that's why people hire you. That's why people hire me, because they want someone to come in and at least give them a vantage point, perhaps, that they didn't see before. So we're getting close to the end. I did want to ask you this question, though, and I don't
Sure.
care how long it runs. It doesn't matter to me. Because when we met at RVAAI that night, Power Possibility, a few weeks ago, we had just briefly talked a little bit about EOS. And we did just a bit. And so I wanted to ask you this question. So I'm very curious about it. So before First Principles Coaching, you were an EOS implementer. Is that a fair
No,
statement?
no. Just to clarify that,
Go ahead.
this is important. No, that was my mentor worked with Gino Wickman when Gino Wickman was developing EOS, and my mentor used a lot of the elements of EOS. And so my first training, and in fact, I worked with the companies that were in the process of implementing EOS, right, when I first started. And so, like, naturally, one of the first places I went and this was actually when I was in the process of trying to figure out what am I going to do. So I was helping out with coaching. So one of the first places I went and signed up for their webinar and whatnot, but it was to be an EOS implementer, right? So I never actually was officially an EOS implementer, just in case. So that's more of the story. But yeah, we chatted briefly about EOS, and one of the things I said, what I said was, the reason I'm not an EOS implementer is because ... So, and I think that's what the thread that you wanted to pick up.
Yeah, I did want to finish. I'm very curious. What changes have you made, or what is the differentiation in your mind between what you do and how you do it and the fundamentals of EOS? Maybe that's the question.
The really simple answer is EOS of itself doesn't really give tools that are about the psychology of the leaders involved. Right.
Right.
And I would even argue that that's when it is phenomenally successful, and they've done a tremendous job of marketing it and all kinds of things. And, but when it doesn't work, I think that's the reason that it doesn't work, is it can be trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot more I could say about that, but that's
no, that's okay. No,
that's
fine. Yeah. I get the impression that it's certainly a successful system.
Right.
Okay. But from my experiences looking at it from the outside in, it can be a bit too rigid, is the word I would use. This is the process. This is how leadership is defined, quote unquote, the people in the seats. And I see leadership a lot differently from that perspective. I want to involve more people into the dynamic of leadership. But to me, that's one of the issues. And I would say, and I'd love to get your impression on it. You don't have to go into too much detail here, and I would say that's one of the implementation issues of it, is that it can be too rigid. Certainly it provides a foundation and a baseline for people who don't have any process, who are just running it out of their back pocket, so to speak.
Right.
So I appreciate that, at what it does. But I think certainly now, and I talk about this all the time, the democratization of knowledge doesn't necessarily mean the people in the seats got all the info they need. to take the organization into the future, especially when you talk about someone who's 26 or 27 years of age and is very adept at prompting AI and really looking at the strategic inferences of the future, if you will. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it works itself out. Anyway, let me ask you the last question, and then we can be done. And that is simply this: where do you see Colin Davis going in the future? What is your hope for the future now, as you sit here having a semi-philosophical conference with me? What do you hold for the future?
So, I am constantly thinking about, the future and goals and dreams and vision and all that stuff. Fundamentally, yeah, I want to live my life making an impact. And I think 3 arenas in which I want to do that. So speaking of mission statement, right? Fundamentally, I want to make an impact in business, in family and local community, and then in the church. I mean, I still am very actively involved in Catholic faith. And it's such a huge institution that has such tremendous potential. We often, if you're kind of an outsider, you often hear just the bad news, which is really unfortunate. It's kind of like the way that, IBM or Apple or whatever can be totally demonized, right? And it takes a lot of work to build what's been built and what it's doing. So anyway, I'm going on and on, but there's the 3 areas that I really like to have an impact. And I would like to build a real coaching firm with a number of coaches working with me, and that can offer different levels of services, because I kind of just have one package right now, basically, or like 2 services, like individual coaching and then team coaching, and I'd like to be able to do more with different size organizations. So that's what I think about.
Yeah. And when it comes to the church, people forget that the people there are good. They're good people, and they're trying to do good things, and they get overlooked in the headlines, if you will.
Yeah.
In any case, Colin, this has been a pure delight for me. I enjoyed the philosophical foray. It was quite enjoyable. Listen, I wish you and your family good health in the future. Much success to you, and thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, John, it was also a pleasure for me. It's good fun. I love to be able to play with ideas and bounce them on back and forth. And so thank you very much for having me.
You are most welcome. This is Dr. John D'Antico. Remember, meaning is the new money, but it requires building the structures that deliver it. If today's conversation challenged your thinking or gave you a framework worth implementing, share it with a leader who needs to hear it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and visit throttleupleadership.com for more resources. Until next time, keep throttling up and keep the people at the center of everything you do.